Hi, I'm Kris from Noise Engineering, and I'm here today with Jeff Rona in his lovely studio.
That is correct.
We're just going to talk a little bit today about what you do and how you do it.
What I do and how I do it. Those are two very good things to talk about.
Yes.
Today.
So, Jeff, I was lucky to be introduced to Jeff a couple months ago by mutual friend Matt Lang.
Matt Lang.
Matt Lang, the bringer of all good things.
The bringer of all good things.
And he brought Jeff over to our house, and we had a really wonderful, fun evening, and that set us up for this really great interview that we're about to have. So, Jeff, why don't you tell me a bit about what you do?
Well, good question. First and foremost, I'm a composer for movies and TV shows and video games, and so I've been doing that for over 20 years. Before that, I was a synthesizer gun for hire here in the studios in Los Angeles, first working on pop records, working with bands and, mostly working with record producers. Worked with Maurice White from Earth, Wind & Fire for many years, and Albie Galutin, who produced the Bee Gees, and Malcolm Cecil, the creator of Tonto, an amazing synthesizer who used to produce Stevie Wonder records, and we worked on some things, and so I had some really nice experiences and training there. But eventually, over time, I took a little time off, and I ended up working for Roland as a technology guy and helping bring MIDI into the world, which is an interesting experience. I put about 10 years of my life into that.
We're definitely going to come back to that.
We can come back to that. And working on some of their first samplers, and I knew how to sample early on. And so I did that for a while, but then eventually I found myself, again, as a synth work, sort of gun for hire, but mostly with film composers, and spent some time in New York. I worked for Philip Glass for a couple of years, off and on. And then here in LA, working with all kinds of composers, from Mark Isham and Hans Zimmer to Basil Polidoris, and that was school for me. That was my school. And eventually that led to me getting a chance to write. Some opportunities came up that some of my mentors couldn't do, mentor clients. And so I got started in television, first doing a lot of TV shows. I've done hundreds of episodes of dramatic, oh my God, what's going to happen next TV. A bunch of movies, both as a solo writer and then collaborating with guys like Hans Zimmer. And I spent quite a lot of time working with Cliff Martinez with a much more electronic approach. And then in the last few years, a lot more has been devoted to doing video games. So that's me in a nutshell.
Very cool. How did you get started as a synth guy for hire?
Well, when I was a kid, I used to take things apart and try to put them back together badly, little amplifiers, and I would get feedback, and I'd be overjoyed at weird noises. My high school got a little suitcase Moog. They used to make these little educational Moogs, and I got to play with that. And then in college, electronic music became a thing. So I went to a small school here in LA, but they had two Putney VCS3s. So those were two of my first instruments. And this guy, ARP 2600. But they still were using tape machines, and so I was doing musique concrète and cutting up chunks of tape, and so I had that experience as well. So I was doing a lot, and then I had this absolutely random meeting. I'm sitting in a theater here in LA, and I hear the guy behind me talking about teaching computers to improvise, and this was a long time ago when this did not exist. So I turned around and introduced myself. And he was a rocket scientist for Jet Propulsion Laboratories, whose hobby was getting a big desktop computer to send out voltages based on a language. And I helped him develop an algorithmic language. So I spent a couple of years doing that, learning how to get a computer to plug into analog synthesizers. And he had a friend whose name escapes me. He was a jazz musician who had a Moog Model 3, serial number 2. In theory, the first one in Los Angeles, he said. And so he had a house in Brentwood. I would go there. I spent about a year spending all my extra time in this little studio with a computer, sending out that I had 8 voltage and trigger outs and being able to patch up things. And that got me into a whole other group of people, and that led me into learning more and more about computers. He became my mentor, which is how I ended up getting involved on the digital side, working with Roland, being a software coder, and did that for 4 years. And then the MIDI thing was a result of that. And then into the studios, and then into my studio to compose.
So let's talk more about this MIDI thing. So what was your role, and how did you end up what did you do with MIDI?
So within a month or two of me starting to work at Roland, and by the way, I got that job as a software programmer by lying. They said, do you know how to program? I said, yeah. I know how to program like high-level custom languages, but like actual machine code and that sort of thing. But I learned super fast, and I developed several products over at Roland. But within a month or two, these 2 Japanese engineers come in with 2 big electric pianos. And they said, we want you to stop what you're doing, and we want you to focus on this. And they turned the machine around, the keyboard around, and there's this little 5-pin plug. They said, that's what we want you to work on. This is a prototype. And it was the very first one in the country.
So the hardware itself was set before
The hardware was set because Dave Smith had already gotten the ball rolling 1 or 2 years earlier. And so there were all these meetings with Dave and some Japanese counterparts at the big companies to start development of a universal protocol that everybody's equipment could use. So those initial conversations had already taken place, but the protocol was by far not set. But the framework was. So within a few weeks, there was a NAMM show.
Woohoo!
Yeah, and so there was a private sort of secret meeting in a conference room that I was asked to go to, and Tom Oberheim was kind of chairing the meeting, but Bob Moog was there. Dave Smith was there, Roger Lynn was there, I was there with my other counterpart at Roland, Jim Mothersbaugh, and Carl Hirano, the developer of the DX7, and a couple other Roland people. And everybody had already been to at least one previous meeting, probably 2 or 3. And I was, the new kid. So they were discussing, well, we really think that we're ready to kind of move forward. And then Tom says, I'm really struggling to keep up with my business. I can't do this. Who wants to do it? Nobody raises their hand. I said, I will. And I'll never forget what Tom said. He said, great. Who the fuck are you? And, but that became the beginning. And they said, fine. I was willing. I didn't have a lot on my plate, so I took on the role of figuring out how to make this thing move forward. So I was the gun, not the bullet. Kris Meyer from Sequential, he was absolutely on fire. Between him, Carl Hirano, one Roland engineer, and a few other people, they knew what to do. And they just didn't know how to make it into a worldwide cooperative. Mm-hmm. But I could. I don't know how I knew I could, but I could. And I spent the next several years building up the machinery that was going to become a cooperative between the engineers and a way of disseminating information to the world. So I started this thing called the MMA, the MIDI Manufacturers Association. I started as a nonprofit. And I built the communications device. I put together the protocol on how engineers could talk about things freely without, fear of any, secrecy issues. And it worked. It all really worked well. So 7 years, I ran everything. Then I stepped down. Jim Cooper took over for a while. I came back for a couple years later, but my career had really started to take off as a composer, and I was no longer able to keep up with things. But for those initial 7 years, everything that needed to happen happened. And, you can't please everybody, but Nobody could fault how we made the decision to do things. And not everybody was 100% on board. Bob Moog, we spent a lot of time talking about the relationship between synthesis and MIDI, because MIDI at the time had very little to do with synthesis. It was really about performance, how to record and play back and edit a performance, how to merge multiple instruments from competing organizations. And Bob didn't feel that MIDI really addressed what was really fascinating to him about the ability to sculpt and mold sound using an arbitrary method of synthesis. I mean, he had his,
Sure.
which, I mean, you know, the 2/3 oscillators filter envelope paradigm hasn't shifted that much since Bob Moog, you know?
Yeah.
Since the 70s, the architecture of the vast majority of synthesis.
Turns out he was onto something.
I think he kind of boiled it down. Anyway, so that was my role, you know, was to oversee everything, to be supportive, to answer questions, to solve thousands and thousands of problems, to translate documents between Japanese and English and the other way around. And it was great. I'm very proud. I got to give the first TED Talk on music technology.
Wow.
And with an emphasis on this new thing called MIDI. Had only been around a few years when TED got started. And, you know, as a result, I made amazing friends in the synth engineering community between Bob and Tom and Roger and Dave and, you know.
Was it hard to walk away from all of that?
A little bit, you know. It was definitely a part of my presence and part of what it gave me an enormous amount of pleasure. I mean, it was all volunteer. Nobody was making any money. Nobody was allowed to. I put that in the bylaws.
Nice.
Nobody can profit from MIDI.
Wow.
From MIDI itself, and that was critical. Nobody can patent it. Nobody can trademark it. Nobody can register it. Nobody can claim any little bitmap of it, and that stuck.
Wow, neat.
Here we are, 37 years later? I was a kid.
Sometimes the idealism of youth is a good thing.
Sometimes the idealism of youth is exactly what's needed.
Yeah.
Until reality comes in.
So 37 years later, you know, at the time MIDI addressed, I think, a lot of things, or pretty much what it needed to. 37 years later, do you have anything that you wish you had done differently?
Not really. You know, anytime somebody refers to technology as future-proof, they're just marketing. You know, everything, we knew fully well that you could divorce the protocol from the hardware. So as the hardware improved, we didn't have to be bound to it. So MIDI over USB running at very, very high speeds versus a 5-pin DIN cable running at the speed of a 25-cent chip, which was very important at the time.
Sure.
The decision was that MIDI could not cost more than $5 to implement into the most expensive product.
Wow.
So, little, except for software. So, the fact that MIDI still functions divorced of hardware protocols has been great. Runs in USB, runs inside of, you know, virtual buses inside every operating system. It's built into Android, it's built into iOS, it's built into Mac OS. I think it's built into Windows, where there's a driver for that, and you just have to download the newest one. And so, you know, it's ubiquitous regardless. Yeah. Now, with, there is an intention for a MIDI 2 to come along, and I've been kind of checking it out and talking with some of the guys in charge of that. And, you know, it builds on a few weaknesses. I mean, you know, the last few years, MPE, the multi pitch bend protocol, so that each note has its own, you know, pitch variations. That's a little bit of a kludge that works very well, you know, and with like the Lindstrument and the Haken and Continuum and all that. So it's been kind of kludged in. MIDI 2 kind of takes the MPE and MIDI and fuses them, and it wraps it in a bidirectional protocol so that your central server, whatever that is, your DAW, your Gizmo, can query your entire studio and go, who knows what? And then the studio goes, well, I know MPE, I don't, I'm MIDI 1, I'm MIDI whatever, and feeds it back. And then that thing can configure so that your user interface is very adept at saying, okay, I'm not going to put a controller on your screen that doesn't exist for that instrument. Mm-hmm. And that's really pretty much it. There's a deeper protocol for naming samples and names for orchestral instruments, so that for people who are using MIDI to do orchestral mock-ups, that's going to get much easier, so that a viola is called viola and not synth 7, you know?
Yeah.
You know, in theory, it's early days, but you know, it doesn't fundamentally change what MIDI is or does. It's more than icing on the cake, but it's adding a layer of elegance towards what is possible these days.
That's pretty impressive that it stood the test of time so well.
Most people think so. I get hate mail occasionally.
Sure. I mean, nothing's perfect.
Nothing's perfect.
But it does serve the purpose pretty well. And, you know, the fact that it's still so ubiquitous.
You know, anytime somebody says, you know, MIDI should have done this and couldn't do this and blah, 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 I just say, well, how many hit records don't use MIDI? I would say it hovers somewhere around 0. You know?
Yeah.
You know, even the Foo Fighters use MIDI. You know, even your basic rock trio still, you know, when they mix their albums, they're using automation in Pro Tools. That's MIDI.
Yeah.
Click tracks. I mean, it really is a ubiquitous tool. Can you work without it? Of course. Has it ever prevented anybody from accomplishing something on a creative level? No. You know, if you don't like it, do something else.
For sure.
And I'm not saying that to be arrogant or flip. It's just that anybody who looks at any technical limitation, you know, any technical limitation of audio protocols, anything, you're not stepping up to creativity. You know, look, you can go to like different kinds of oil paints versus acrylics, and you know, some paints can cover in one coat, some can't. So does any painter go, you know, if the paint that I bought could have covered in one coat and I couldn't see that thing through the back, and you know, the reflectivity of the titanium oxide in the pigment, you know, doesn't quite have the shimmer that I was hoping it would because it's too translucent. Well, is that why you're not a more successful painter? Well, I don't think so.
The same goes with any tool, right? Maybe you just need a different tool.
Maybe you need a different tool.
And that's fine. If it's not MIDI, it's not MIDI. If it's not that particular synth, it's not that particular synth. But, you know, sometimes every tool has a limitation.
You know, I admire those human beings who look at the world and go, you know, it's not up to my quality standards. I'm going to change it. And, you know, that's beautiful. And I think technology advances because of those people who are fundamentally unhappy with the status quo. It's certainly how MIDI came about. It's certainly how a lot of synthesis came about. It's how all software comes into being. Somebody goes, you know, I think there's a better way to do this. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. But, you know, technology thrives on a little bit of dissatisfaction. But from the perspective of an artist saying, I'd be more successful if this thing that doesn't exist exists and I can't figure out how to do that. Well, you know, I don't play guitar very well. It does, you know, I can't use that as an excuse.
So let's talk a bit about what you do play. So you've been composing for a while. Not to have you name drop per se, but what are some of the things you have worked on that you've particularly enjoyed working
on? You know, I started in TV in the mid-90s, and the very first TV show I ever worked on was a show that Barry Levinson was a great film director, and I'd contributed a little bit of music to one of his films, and he liked what I did, and invited me to write on his first television show. And it was called Homicide, And it's the show that led to The Wire and Treme and Oz, because it's the same people.
Mm-hmm.
But it was the first time that a TV score could be like ambient and weird and experimental, and I was allowed to get away with utter murder. And that was really exciting for me. Around that time, I was also starting to work with Cliff Martinez. We did this crazy movie called Kafka for Steven Soderbergh. And then after that, Traffic. And working with Cliff on those projects was phenomenal. And around the same time, I was also doing more and more work with Hans Zimmer. And, I worked on this film called Black Hawk Down. It was a Ridley Scott film. And the very first movie I ever scored was for Ridley Scott, which was great. He had just, chucked out a score and had serious time issues, and I was literally the only person who could write a score in 3 weeks. Allegedly, we'll never know because, well, I'd never done it before, but failure is not always an option. So, working with Hans is great because he has a deep synthesis background. He also has a great music production background, coming from advertising and pop music. And I had come from pop music. And so, this idea that it's not just about the notes, it's about understanding production and how to fuse those in the most creative way possible when the clock is ticking and when you have limits, pop records don't have the same limits. They'll work on a song until it's done. With a film or a TV score, it's like, well, it's Thursday and it's 11:30. You have to be done by 4. Sometimes it's what you can do in 15 minutes, which means having a certain grasp of the tools becomes really important. Anyway, since then I've scored, I don't know, a few hundred episodes of different TV shows and all over the map, a lot of documentary films, and lately more video games and games I started about 8-9 years ago. I did one called God of War 3, which was very popular, and then worked on one called Far Cry, which was pretty popular, and just this year did one called Devil May Cry, which has been super popular. It was the #1 game this year for a month, which I guess is good. So there's all of that. Plus, I have like a couple little side hustles. I run a music library company called Liquid Cinema. We do trailer music, and we do underscore, and we do source music. And have a little tiny music software company. We do plugins under the name Wide Blue Sky. Wide Blue Sound, rather. Wide Blue Sky is my production company. That's that.
So when you're composing for film, etc., I assume you still enjoy composing more for yourself as well.
Absolutely. I'm finishing up my second solo album. I waited a long time to get into doing my own music and releasing it. Every soundtrack I have, a few dozen soundtrack albums, but they're soundtracks.
Right.
Only a year and a half ago did I release my first solo album. Just music that I wanted to put out.
How would you describe your own solo stuff?
Fairly ambient, I think would be the word, but with some other characteristics. There's one thing I left out of my little curriculum vitae, and thank you for reminding me. I've only been in one serious band. I have very little experience as a live performer, but through a mutual friend, I was introduced to this musician named John Hassel, and John has been a partner of Brian Eno's from day one. He was a big part of my life in the Bush of Ghosts, and John is really so well respected in the world of more ambient experimental music. He's really kind of the godfather of bringing world music into more experimental Western styles. And so I was in his band for a couple of years, and we did a couple of albums together, and performed live. We did one concert with Brian Eno in New York. We did 2 concerts, and then we did some touring around the world. And I was doing all electronics, mostly samples that I created. but it was part of how I started to really develop a slightly different technique for composing. And with John's band, there's 5 of us, excuse me, we would come and we would just sit in a room and improvise, just anything, just throw spaghetti against the wall. And he would record it. And then a week later, he would say, okay, I've edited out all the parts I hate. Here's what's left. Listen to it, and then we're going to improvise again. And so we would do this again and again and again. And so it's this concept that composing is based on a form of filtering. You know, that a composer is a filter. A record producer, in essence, is a filter. Their job is to say, it's not so much this is good and this is bad. It's to say this stays and this goes.
This fits.
This fits, you know. There's a difference between good and right.
Sure.
And learning that difference is maybe one of the hardest things there is for an artist to do. The difference between good and right. And I think working in this much more experimental way of giving yourself permission to try whatever you want to try, but then filtering some of it out and some of it out and some of it out, and then at the end, you're there.
So would you say that this informs both your solo project and your work, your composition?
100%. Absolutely.
The process is pretty similar on both?
100%, you know, except for the deadlines.
Sure.
So if I'm writing a film score or any kind of a score, it begins with an intent. This is a movie that needs to express a moral issue or a romantic issue or a paranormal issue, whatever it is. Something has to there has to be a front door. And that front door can be a big door and can be a small door. But how you get there is through trial and error, experimentation, and not judging anything. This idea of not being judgmental towards your own creativity is really hard. A lot of people kind of freak out like, oh, the next thing that comes out of my fingers touching this keyboard has to be pearls of genius. Well, no, actually it doesn't. That can come in an hour or two. You know, I will just hit go on my sequencer and just play for a half hour and just record and record and record. And eventually I might come on an idea and then repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. So I will be that's my filtration process. Then that's sort of on the more melodic side if I'm doing something that is that. But when it comes to more electronic stuff, it's about looking at what's available to me. Do I want to start with, putting an EBow on an electric guitar or on an electric cello, or pick up one of my 100 woodwind instruments, or do I want to experiment with a plugin? Do I want to do something in Reactor or Max, or do I want to do something with the newest plugin that just showed up? And then start processing it and processing it and processing it until at one moment something makes me go, wait a minute, that's not so bad. So it's sort of a sandbox approach. And actually this kind of ties into my whole experience with modular synthesis and about the folly of control. When you sit down at a piano, you kind of have to feel a sense of mastery and control. There is an aspect of technique and virtuosity that's required to create emotion on a musical instrument. If I were to get in front of an audience with an acoustic guitar, could I make them cry? Yes, I could, but not for the reasons you would want. Not the good way. And that's really important. So my studio is my instrument. I don't really I grew up a woodwind player. That's the only thing I play particularly well. Everything else in my studio is an oscillator. It's just a source of vibration that I can control or not control in different ways. And some things I have a tremendous control over. I certainly know how to operate most of the equipment, not all of it. And actually that gets to a kind of an important thing. But that idea that you think you're in control, or you're willing to allow yourself to not necessarily be in control. I love standing right in the middle of that. I love being on that razor's edge between control and, I don't know if I want to say happy accidents, but the ability to get involved in a process for which the outcome may elude me at first, but I will stop when I'm happy. And for me, that's kind of what's brought me back to modular, because I left it. I sold everything. I had hundreds of modules over the years, and one day I sold everything.
Why?
Didn't feel like it. It didn't feel like a fit to my creative process anymore. I wanted to get inside the box from day one, and when I did that one movie, Black Hawk Down, I wrote the very first cue in a major motion picture that was written without a single wire. There wasn't one audio cable. There wasn't an external mixer, and that movie was 2001, and that the technology was just barely there. A lot of pre-rendering and freezing, and but I did it. I wrote several cues for that film, and not one sound passed through a single wire. 100% software, and I was thrilled. It had huge limitations because the technology was what it was. It's always crude in hindsight. Imagine what this is going to feel like in 20 years. It's going to be fucking barbaric, isn't
Totally.
it? Or not. And so I felt that was the direction I wanted to take. It was faster. The technology was catching up. Computers were getting faster. More interesting people were developing software. Sequencers were starting to be enjoyable and not just, painful hair-pulling exercises. So I sold off everything. It was just sitting gathering dust. People were asking me why I kept it around. I had a Roland 700 system, then a Roland 100, so I went from quarter inch to eighth inch. Then I had a massive all Doepfer system. Dieter used to come by, and so he was sort of our local drug pusher at the time. And so I built a whole system out of his stuff, and Hans and I both bought all of the last Roland System 100 modules. We found out that there were piles of them in a warehouse, and I went to the president of Roland, since they were my alma mater. I said, I see that you have these modules. He goes, yeah. I said, how much to sell them? He goes, I'll sell them to you for $25 each if you buy all of them. And there were hundreds and hundreds. So we bought them all.
Wow.
But I got rid of it all and probably didn't touch a modular synth. I still had my Moog and my ARP and my Jupiter, and used them occasionally, not a lot. They're nice eye candy when people walk into the studio, but they weren't really serving purpose. I was far more, I'll be honest with you, I was so much more interested in Max MSP, Reactor, Kima, C-Sound, and working in a software environment because I was hearing things that I was just attracted to. Mm-hmm. I loved what was coming out of this process of working in software and virtual and sampling, and I was good at it. So it allowed me to achieve what I was thinking about as a musician. And then I think I just got into this thing about not mastery, but control, this folly of control. I think I know what I'm doing over here, but frankly, only in the last few years has there, as modular has sort of entered into this new wave of thinking, that I got excited again, because the instruments are starting to get really clever and interesting and a little more out of control and a little less easy to understand from just this, well, there's a cutoff knob and resonance, and that makes me happy.
Just the sheer number of modules that are coming out at this point means that there has to be something interesting. There's so many new manufacturers, there's so many new ideas in modular.
Yeah, well, you're the craft beer of music production, you know. I don't know how sustainable this business model is, but that's not my issue. But here's the thing. I decided to get back into it only because companies like yours and a tiny handful of others truly excite me. and truly make me think,
Thank you.
I want to experiment, because now modules, or just the process of modular synthesis, has gotten more experimental. Look, starting off with, an ARP or a VCS3 with a pin matrix, and as the pins get older and they get a little more oxidized, they lose some of their their conductivity. So you started to get like weird little blurbs and stuff and little R2D2 noises that you didn't mean to, and then you go, quick, hit record. This is amazing. But now companies like Noise Engineering are really building modules that kind of have depth. They invite you to experiment and try things that aren't immediately clear and immediately obvious. You really have to kind of spend time with some of these modules and go, wait a minute, I don't quite understand what that knob or that plug does. It's not clear from the label. It's not clear from just looking at it. It's not really even clear from the manual, if there is one, what that does. And the fact that you can start to blend different levels of mystery and depth. And I mean, I've gone through your modules and other people's modules, and some are better designed than others. Some are very easy to master. Maybe it takes an hour. Some you can kind of never master. And music is like that. Music is that thing you can never master. But now modular synthesis has started to become really interesting to me again. And I'm so happy that, companies, again, like yours, have gone beyond the obvious. How many oscillators do we need? How many filters do we need? The answer is I don't think we're done at all with the basics, but sometimes it's more about the attitude, about the relationship between the musician and the tool, like you said. And there's kind of for every different kind of artists, there's a different way to think about that relationship.
For sure.
And you could kind of, like if you're going to build a module for Deadmau5, you're going to build something differently than if you were going to build one for Ryuichi Sakamoto or Brian Eno. Right. And yet, I would love to know what inspires Noise Engineering to go in a particular route with, why put a, bipolar connection on a thing? Why would you want an inverted voltage right on the front? I could do that myself, but you did it for some reason. And then I go, oh, because it makes perfect sense to me now. So I think it's just become a little more personal, a little more out of my control. I like when I go to this, I don't feel as in control as I do sitting at my DAW. And that's a great feeling. That to me is the essence of why I've come back to modular, is so that I can feel a little less in control. I mean, I always think to myself, okay, I want to do a drone, I want to do a bass sequence, I want to do a shimmer, whatever. I have a sense, but how I get there is it always ends up differently than I intended. And I go down these long rabbit holes into dead ends where it's like, that was just stupid, and this isn't going to work. Let me backtrack, unplug.
It's comforting to hear you say that too.
Well, this is part of a longer conversation about sound design and intent. I think there really are two sort of thoughts on this, which is you start with an intent and you finish with that intent realized. And then there's and that's not me. And I've been laughed at about this, that what is it? Oh, Scotchgard wasn't invented. No, I'm sorry. Sticky notes actually started off as being a water repellent, but ended up failing as a water repellent for clothing, but ended up being perfect for sticky notes. So that's how I write music with this. I start with water repellent and I end up with a mild adhesive.
That's a great metaphor. Well, if it's any consolation, we once calculated how many different sounds you could get out of the BIA, and this applies to pretty much all of our oscillators that are in 10 HP, and it was literally millions because of all of the different combinations of knobs. So,
And that's probably assuming a kind of a static approach as opposed to thinking in time.
yes.
Well, a lot of my thinking involves time.
Yeah.
It's
so,
not about a sound, it's about, well, not to interrupt, but it's interesting to think about static stasis in music. If you look at the instruments of an orchestra, any instrument that has the ability to sustain, a bowed string, a woodwind, a brass instrument, there's no such thing as a note that stays level. It's getting louder, it's getting softer, it's getting brighter, it's getting duller, it has vibrato. The bow is, missing a little bit of rosin for a couple of waveforms. So, there's no such thing as stasis, which is why it's interesting to me that there's been such an interest in wavetables, because wavetables in and of themselves tend to be fairly static until you have motion within the wavetable, and thank God for that. But, before the first sampler, there was no such thing as a sound that ever repeated itself. It wasn't until Roger Lynn or somebody sampled a snare drum and, Prince, triggered it, where there was such a thing as a waveform that repeated literally. I don't think the human ear in all of evolution has ever heard a sound repeat, but you've probably never heard a sound just be a static tone. It doesn't exist in nature. Test oscillators probably are the scored a fantastic planet, and B.B. Barron and her husband Lewis, and again, did they know what they were doing? No, but they changed the world with what they did.
That's a really interesting point. Just even looking back, this is a complete tangent that we'll probably edit out, but looking
I hope
back
not.
at my life as a biologist, if I went and recorded an individual frog, no two calls of that frog were the same.
Right.
Like every single call from an individual frog has variation.
Mm-hmm. So you had frogs that would return your calls. That's amazing.
Well, yes, they do that, but also if I'm just recording a frog, like sticking a mic in its face and it's calling, they'll call over
a frog
and over
call.
and over.
Got it. No, why would it? It's impossible. I mean, frankly, the best drummer in the world, if you asked a drummer to hit a snare drum with a stick 100 times,
it's going to sound different every damn time.
Every single one. It's impossible otherwise. And even if you said, hit it exactly the same spot, same velocity, you'll have 100 different recordings of that drum. And so my whole attitude about synthesis is to avoid anything that even remotely sounds static. When I built my software synthesizer, it's based on samples that are actually several minutes long that have subtle variations and then loop, but every and then you layer those, but in that sort of Eno-ish way that they're all different lengths. Mm-hmm. So there's literally no way to repeat it. Even after I could hit a single note and 100 years later it will not have repeated. Trust me. Yeah, don't test me on that. Don't come calling me in 100 years and say it repeated.
I've been listening. So, how do you go from here to there when you're actually in the process of working on a score?
A couple different ways. So, I have a little sequencer here. I have a little Arturia BeatStep Pro, and so this rig here, which is the BeatStep with a Mini Moog, the ARP, my modular, and there's that Jupiter 8 which sometimes enters into it. I can control all of that from here. So one thing that I can do is I'll just stand here for hours just playing. And sometimes I'll come up with a sound and I'll just go, let's sample that. Just sample it, and that's all it is. It might be something rhythmic, and we'll sample it at a particular tempo, or I'll vary, and we'll record it at maybe 3 or 4 different tempos, load it into a sampler. And that's for more experimental things. And that's method number one. Number two is the Arturia BeatStep is a MIDI to CV converter. So I have MIDI over USB going from my sequencer into the Arturia, and then I have voltages, not a ton, but I have voltages because it has two pitch, gate, velocity, and then it has 8 triggers. So and then the sequencer here also can locks to there. So over USB, I can play from a sequence there, and just if I'm just trying to get a cool sound but play it under my control melodically, I can play the modular, the ARP, the Moog. They're all set to go. And my Jupiter 8 has a MIDI, has the Encore MIDI retrofit in it. And the Arturia has a mode for the S trigger on the Moog. Okay. And then the ARP is just pretty straightforward. So my second method is to send MIDI in. Then I had somebody build a little patch bay that's up in the upper right corner. And that just has 8 audio ins, which then go into this little Motu box, which has analog input to light pipe out, and then the light pipe goes over back into my DAW. Nice. And it shows up as up to 8 or 16 audio inputs. And then, and the way I have it set up, actually the patch I have set up right now, I've bypassed the mixer that's up there, and just have like 4 or 5 different ideas that are like layers. So I have like 4 or 5 ideas that are all designed to go together, going back into my DAW, and they're each coming up on a separate fader on my fader box up there.
Nice.
So it's either like pure experimentation and then sample it and record it, or what we have now is this link where I can have it play. But the minute I have something I hear that I like, then each track is armed to record. So then I can take a fairly complicated or layered idea in the rig and record it onto multiple tracks, stereo or mono. There's not a lot stereo here, but like some of the effects are sort of kind of quasi stereo. They claim to be stereo. So sometimes I go in stereo, but usually it's just 8 mono cents, because I'll put plugins. Sure. So then I go further. I record, I can chop up, I can decide when I want things to come. Then it enters into that lovely world of digital audio where things are extremely repeatable, things are locked. I can, zoom in and make sure that if there's any latency between MIDI, USB, conversion to voltage and trigger into, my clock module, my Pamela's New Workout, into the trigger, back into the Motu, converting analog back into digital, sending it over there.
It's sweet that you say if there's any latency.
Well, so then I line things back up. So we get all of our, if there are transients, we line them back up by hand. It's easy.
And what percentage, or I guess, can you quantify a bit about how much you use modular in your average composing life?
It's on the upward trend right now. Haven't used it much on any recent films, but on the last video games that I did, like on Devil May Cry 5, there's quite a lot. We recorded that last year, and it was fun. It was a great opportunity to sometimes add even like a little background, like little crushed, noisy spattering of sound. Sometimes it's just in the background, but also the ability to create cool little ambient backgrounds and then compose on top of them, I can do here really nicely, and comes out quite differently than doing it in inside the box. So now it's gotten more so. On the solo album that I'm working on now, it's actually getting used quite a lot, and used in a much more forward featured way. The Sync-Iter has been a lovely module on that front. So now the answer is more and more, because I have a fairly streamlined method, and it works really well. So, honestly, if deadlines are super intense, hard to say. But I'm starting a video game this week, and I wrote a couple of sketches for it last week, and definitely used some of the modular on the sketches, and they liked the sketches. So
Great.
we haven't figured out what the next step is, because I wrote a bunch of different ideas, and now we're kind of honing. We're in that filtering mode now, where we're deciding the difference between we like it and we like it enough to keep going. So that's where we're at now. So the answer is, it's I can work without it, but I'm really enjoying doing what I'm doing with it.
Awesome.
Thank you to you and the noise engineering team for getting me far more inspired to get further into modular again when it is not the most convenient route. I admire what you guys do, and right now I love the place where you're at, where you haven't gone so fully digital with touch screens and all of that. Not that you shouldn't, and that's up to you, but I'm very inspired by what you guys are doing right now, and you're at the very top of the list.
Well, thank you so much.
So,
that means a
more,
lot to us.
yes, please, more, please.
Oh, we have no plans to stop. We have dog mouths to feed, so
Yeah.